Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 1 about World War II. Again, I must apologize for the air conditioner in the background. It's unfortunately necessary here. So I'd like to start off by looking at a couple of these images, these main images we're using on the title card for this lecture. And of course, the one on the left is the famous flag raising at Iwo Jima during the Pacific Campaign. That was actually the second flag raising. There were two flag raisings. That's a long story. But if you ever want to hear be bored of the sound of my voice, ask me about it one day. And then the other one is a poster for Service on the Home Front. And I picked this one specifically because this is put out by the Pennsylvania State Council of Defense in Harrisburg, obviously. So it's kind of local, and it shows, in very WPA sort of imagery, a husband, a wife, and a daughter, all committing to working for working on the home front for the war effort. Now you'll see on the left of that poster there's the Citizens Defense Corps, the Citizen Service Corps, American Unity, various salvage programs, and victory gardens. Okay. So these are important images, and all states had these, and there were a number of national ones, and it was a very big effort. One of the things that historians like so much about World War II is the art is fantastic, and I don't mean fantastic in a morally good way necessarily, because obviously we have there are some terrible things going on, and the Nazis and the Japanese were just as good at their propaganda as the Allies were, but there were just so many stark images, and it was so effective on all sides that I think it's important to look at. Now, I'm sorry that I've thrown in here a sheet of 50 miniature reproductions of World War II posters, but it kind of shows you all the different kind of things in the United States. The themes included invocations of freedom, depictions of the enemy, calls for disciplined labor, warning against inadvertently revealing military secrets, loose lips sinks ships, that kind of thing. And a group called Artists for Victory, which was founded in 1942, sponsored a national poster competition and encouraged artists to use their talent to promote the Allied war effort. I think all of these are Allied posters, but if you Google World War II propaganda posters, you'll see posters from all the belligerents, and they really are very, very interesting and very, very stark. So let me start off with this focus question. What steps led to American participation in World War II? The thing to do is to look at FDR's foreign policy to begin with. The country had, as you've been reading, the country was facing tremendous economic crises in the 1930s, and so international affairs garnered little public attention. But Franklin Roosevelt innovated in foreign policy and domestic policy. First thing is 1933, in an effort to encourage trade, he recognized the Soviet Union. He also repudiated the right to intervene militarily with military force in the internal affairs of Latin American nations, and this was called the Good Neighbor policy. The U.S. withdrew troops from Hawaii, and Nicaragua accepted Cuba's repeal of the Platt Amendment, which had authorized U.S. intervention in that nation. And but like previous presidents, right, like Wilson especially, Roosevelt recognized undemocratic governors, such as that of Somoza in Nicaragua, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and Batista in Cuba. However, the United States also took steps to counteract German influence in Latin America by expanding trade and promoting American culture there. Now, one of the things that I think modern historians like to emphasize is that World War II really should be seen in very broad terms chronologically, right? Events in Asia and Europe quickly took center stage in the 30s as international order and the rule of law seemed to disintegrate. In 1931, seeking to expand its power in Asia, Japan invaded Manchuria, which is a northern province in China. And in 1937, it pushed further, massacring 300,000 Chinese prisoners of war and civilians in Nanjing. And in Europe, after consolidating his rule within Germany, Hitler launched a campaign to dominate the continent. The first thing he did was violate the Versailles Treaty by pursuing a massive rearmament, and in 1936 by sending troops into the Rhineland. And Rhineland was a demilitarized zone between France and Germany, and the Rhineland, sort of broadly defined, has been fought over between France and Germany, or earlier versions of France and Germany, since the time of Charlemagne's death in 814. Okay, so the failure of Britain and France and the United States to oppose Hitler's aggression really convinced him that these democracies wouldn't resist what he was doing. Okay, and then down in Italy, Benito Mussolini, was the father of fascism, invaded and conquered Ethiopia. Okay? And then in 1936, General Francisco Franco mounted a rebellion against the democratically elected government of Spain. Okay, this is the famous Spanish Civil War, and the crucial thing, I mean, it was very important for Spain, obviously, but the crucial thing for World War II history is that Hitler and Mussolini sent men in arms to support him. In 1939, Franco won and established another fascist government in Europe. So you had fascist government in Germany, you had fascist government in Italy, fascist government in Germany in the east, fascist government in Italy in the south, and a fascist government in Spain in the west. Okay, Hitler annexed Austria in the Sudetenland, which was a German area of Czechoslovakia, and soon thereafter invaded and annexed all of Czechoslovakia as well. Okay, so things are looking very bleak and very extreme in Europe certainly by 1939. FDR became increasingly alarmed by Hitler's actions in Germany and Europe, but in 1937 he called only for a quarantine of aggressors. Right? The U.S., partly because of pressures at home, isolationist pressures at home, U.S. and FDR had really little choice but to follow the appeasement policy of France and Britain. They hoped that the appeasement policy hoped that agreeing to Hitler's demands could prevent a larger war. In 1838, for instance, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich, the famous Munich Conference, and which awarded the Sudetenland to Hitler, and he promoted the Munich conference and the agreements there as promising, quote, peace in our time. Now, one of the things that is so important in this period, and again, this becomes more obvious when the U.S. actually enters the war, but these are a series of posters of paintings by Norman Rockwell, who's undoubtedly the most famous American painter of the 20th century, in the U.S. anyway. Okay, and so the War Office of Information reproduced these paintings of what was known as the Four Freedoms. Roosevelt had outlined these four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, as shorthand for America's purposes in World War II. And I'm sorry that the pictures are a little blurry. I wanted to get all four images on them on the one slide. But you've seen this before, I'm sure, especially the freedom from want picture, which depicts a family at Thanksgiving, okay, with an abundant dinner. The other thing is that, remember, as I keep saying, there are people who are paying attention. This is the thing about history we tend to forget. Now, most people are obviously, well, probably too busy with their daily lives, but there are an awful lot of people who are paying attention to what's going on in Europe, worried about what's going on in Europe. This is a demonstration sponsored by Jewish organizations in New York City's Madison Square Garden in 1937, demanding American action against Nazi Germany. in this case, boycott Nazi Germany. Don't buy anything from them. Don't sell anything to them. Okay. At this time, most Americans were opposed to getting involved in European affairs. Now, we call those people isolationists, which I'll explain more in a second, but even that is more complicated than you're probably used to hearing. Okay. Although people are paying attention, the threat posed by Germany, the threat posed by Japan, seem really distant to most Americans. And in fact, Hitler had many admirers in America, from those who praised his anti-communism to businessmen who profited from trading and doing business with the Nazis, such as Henry Ford. Trade also continued with Japan, including shipments of American trucks, aircraft, oil, which amounted to 80% of Japan's oil supply. Remember that. The United States oil exports amounted to 80% of Japan's oil supply. Okay. By this time, by the late 30s, many Americans had come to believe that American involvement in World War II in World War I had been a mistake. It had only benefited international bankers and arms producers, and there was a lot of popular agitation about this. Pacifism became much more important. It attracted supporters across the country, from small towns to college campuses to urban areas. Some Americans of German and Italian descent also sympathized with fascist governments in their homelands, and Irish Americans remained staunchly anti-British, right? Isolationism dominated Congress, and in 1935, Congress started to enact a series of neutrality acts banning travel on belligerent ships and arms shipments to warring nations. Okay? These were intended to prevent the U.S. from becoming embroiled in these conflicts by demanding freedom of the seas, just like it had in World War I. Now, traditionally, the isolationists are seen as this sort of extreme group who are anti-international and sort of pro-Hitler and that sort of thing. But what historians have come to realize and discover, because they've actually literally discovered more information and dug up more documents and analyzed it more extensively, is that there was a range of isolationism, right? And there were some extreme isolationists like Charles Lindbergh, who was even a sort of a Nazi sympathizer, all the way to the isolationists who basically said, look, as things started to really look bad in 38 and 39, look, nothing's more common in world history than Europeans fighting each other. And why should here it is happening again, just one generation after the Great War. Why should we get involved in that? It's not going to benefit the United States. In fact, all it's going to do is kill American soldiers, and there'll be another European war. Okay, in the late 30s, you had isolationists putting out posters saying, yeah, there was a war in 1914, there's going to be a war in 1939, there'll be a war in 1960, 61, there'll be a war in 1981, and on and on and on in Europe. That's what they do. So we don't paint isolationists with one broad brush like we used to. Okay, and I think that's important to remember. And that's one of the reasons why, sorry, I'm going on about this, but it's sort of the new interpretation, the better interpretation, I should say. It's one of the reasons why isolationists, the vast majority of isolationists are so quick to change their minds after Pearl Harbor. But anyway, okay. During the Spanish Civil War, between the Democratic Republic of Spain and the fascist dictator Franco, the U.S. and other governments imposed an arms embargo on both sides. Okay, the U.S., France, and Britain. And what that meant was it allowed Germany and Italy to help Franco overwhelm the government forces. Okay? Now, it's too much to say that the Spanish-American War was sort of like the dress rehearsal for the European theater in World War II. But it's not a bad way to think about it, because what happens is Hitler, especially, and Mussolini use their help for the Spanish fascists as a sort of testing ground, a proving ground for certain things like the Blitzkrieg. testing out certain type of aircraft to see how well it worked. The Battle of France in 1940 had really started in 1936 7 in Spain, because Germany was testing out all its weapons and getting ready. Okay, now, so let me get to the actual outbreak of the war. Okay, remember Munich, 1938. Britain and France capitulate to Hitler's aggression. 1939, right? The Soviet Union proposed an international agreement to oppose further German demands for territory, but Britain and France, both of which distrusted Stalin and saw Germany as a fortress that would check communist power in Europe, declined to join in that agreement. Okay, remember, again, people are paying attention. They don't like Stalin either. So what happens is then Stalin turns around and signs a non-aggression pact with Hitler, his former enemy. Bada bing, September 1939, Hitler invades Poland. Britain and France, who had treaties with Poland, were allied with Poland, now declared war on Germany. But within a year, the Nazi Blitzkrieg, it's known as Lightning War, overran Poland, much of Scandinavia, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And by June 1940, German troops occupied Paris. Okay. Hitler now dominated Europe and North America, continental Europe and North America. And in September 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan formally created a military alliance known as the Axis powers. Okay, and 1940 is a crucial year, because what happens is that the only country in Europe who's standing opposed to Hitler is Britain, right? Winston Churchill gets a lot of credit for this. He probably gets too much credit. There were an awful lot of people in Britain an awful lot of government ministers, an awful lot of military people who were also agreed. But the popular notion is that Hitler stood alone and saved Western civilization. That's a gross exaggeration, but that's, again, one of the things I can talk about till the end of time if you ever want to get bored of the sound of my voice. But what happens in 1940 is the famous Battle of Britain. Okay, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, is able to, through anti-aircraft work and also by air-to-air combat, is able to defend Britain from German planes and bombers, right? Now, German bombs devastated London, devastated other cities, but the German air campaign eventually fails, and the threat of the invasion of Britain was repelled, okay? Churchill, by the way, made a big deal of asking the United States for help. He often referred to, the new world needs to come to rescue the old world. Depending on who you read, of course, that Churchill gets credit for dragging the U.S. into the war, and that's not true. It's the Japanese who dragged the U.S. in the war in Pearl Harbor. But of course, Churchill writes famous books about the war after the war, and that's how that perception has fed us, has been fed to us, I should say. I like this cartoon. This is a 1940 war cartoon, American war cartoon, and war clouds engulf Europe, and Uncle Sam observes that the Atlantic Ocean no longer seems to shield the United States from involvement. It ain't what it used to be, and the Atlantic Ocean is just a sliver. Okay. So that's the way the tension is sort of reaching U.S. shores by 1940. Okay. All right. So this, again, is still 1940. The United States is still not involved in the war. FDR considered Hitler a direct threat to the United States. That's important. Considered him a direct threat. But most Americans wanted to stay out of the war. Okay. After a fierce debate, in 1940, Congress approved plans for military rearmament within the United States and agreed to sell arms to Britain on what was known as a cash and carry basis. Britain would pay cash for arms and transport them in British ships. Okay. Now, Roosevelt realizes he can't go any further than that because the isolationists won't have it, and he's looking to run for re-election in 1940 for a third term, unprecedented. Okay, and so he tries not to antagonize the opponents of American intervention. These people included, as I say, Henry Ford, Father Coughlin, who was a fire-breathing priest on the radio, Charles Lindbergh. Father Coughlin was also a fire-breathing anti-Semite. Charles Lindbergh, of course, this huge American hero, was against the war, right? But anyway, so Roosevelt breaks president by running for a third term. The Republicans nominate Wendell Willkie, who was a Wall Street businessman. He was a lawyer, amateur politician, really a crappy kind of candidate. There wasn't much difference between the two ideologically. They both supported the first peacetime draft, which was passed in September 1940. They both supported more or less New Deal legislation, but most historians agree that Americans don't want to change horses in midstream. So FDR wins that election by a decisive margin. In 1941, the U.S. became closer to the nations fighting Germany and Japan, and Roosevelt declared that America would be, quote, a great arsenal of democracy. Now, remember the cash and carry thing with British stuff? Well, Britain had, by this time, was close to bankruptcy. So Roosevelt had Congress pass the Lend-Lease Act. Lend-Lease. This allowed military aid to go to countries that promised to repay the loans after the war and to lease equipment from the United States after the war. So under Lend-Lease, the U.S. funneled billions of dollars worth of arms to China, for instance, which is almost always forgotten about, and to the Soviet Union, which is almost forgotten about, and of course to Britain. Okay. And some Americans, don't forget, there are a number of interventionist Americans actively campaign for U.S. involvement in the war, and they form societies that demand for declarations of war, especially against Germany. Okay. Now, crucially, the big thing is the U.S. Embargoes oil to Japan, right, in 1941. Remember what I said before, that 80% of Japanese oil supplies came from the United States? Well, you embargo that oil and suddenly Japan is cut off from oil. And so in retaliation, December 4th, 1941, as you all know, Japanese planes launched a surprise attack from aircraft carriers and bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, this assault killed more than 2,000 American soldiers and destroyed much of the base and much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, except for crucial aircraft carriers, which had been out on sort of maneuvers, practice maneuvers. And the survival of those aircraft carriers really helped the nation win critical victories in the Pacific. So Roosevelt goes to Congress. He's a national address, but he also goes to Congress and calls December 7th the date which will live in infamy, and asks Congress to declare war on Japan. Which Congress does declare war on Japan. There's only one dissenting vote. And then the crucial thing, which was not automatic, crucial because even though Japan and Germany and Italy were Axis powers together, Germany declared war on the United States on December 8th, and America retaliated and declared war. So the United States had finally entered what was already the largest war in history. Okay. Here's a newsreel theater in Times Square announcing Hitler's blitzkrieg in Europe in the spring of 1940. Newsreel theaters actually were places where you went and watched the news. Remember, there aren't any televisions at this time. Here are a couple of battleships destroyed during. They weren't destroyed. They were heavily bombed. The West Virginia and the Tennessee. Back then, I think battleships were all named after states. Anyway, here they are in flames during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay. Both of them were, of course, repaired, as I said. And by 1942, the fighting in the war in the Pacific Theater had been very, very brutal. Some 13,000 American troops were forced to surrender to the Japanese on Corregidor in the Philippines in May 1942. But generally speaking, the policy of island hopping across the Pacific became the way of moving the American Army, Navy, Army, Marines across the Pacific. Okay, now this is what I want to show you. This map about the Pacific Theater. Okay, if you take the Japanese thrust towards Pearl Harbor December 7th, right? Okay, that's as far east as they get, right? From then on, it's a series of Allied attacks back westward. Now, this does not mean that it was inevitable that the Allies would conquer Japan and defeat Japan by this process. After all, Japan was extremely powerful, extremely militaristic, had gained an enormous amount of raw materials by their capture of vast areas of China. But you can kind of see this as sort of stepping stones. First, there's the Battle of Midway, which is probably the most decisive battle in mid 1942. That's one, and then eventually there's the Guam, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, and on and on and on until ultimately they recapture the Philippines and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here's an American soldier capturing German prisoners of war. Notice the first thing you undoubtedly notice about this is that although some of these German soldiers look to be, in their 30s, these two guys are obviously 15 at most. This is a picture from 1944, so it's quite late in the war, but it shows that Germany is really desperate for men by that period. Okay. All right, now I don't want to go into too much detail about the land battles in Europe, or even the naval battles in Europe. I should say naval battles around Europe, but this is another good map that shows you that Germany ultimately is squeezed both from the west and from the east, okay, especially from the Soviet Union. Now notice how the pink areas, first of all, there's Germany in this sort of peach color. Germany and Italy is peach color. Then the pink areas are the Axis countries, or the areas that the Axis controlled at its height. And that's way, way into the Soviet Union. The crucial battle that stopped that is Leningrad. And you see all these dates here, 1944, 43, 44. That's when the tide turns. Things move back east. Also 1944, D-Day, up here in the left-hand corner, is launched. And Germany is squeezed from the west. Now, again, none of this is really inevitable, but it's pretty certain that by 1943, when it becomes obvious that the British and American bombing of German cities was far more devastating than anyone had thought it would be, it was pretty clear that it was just a matter of time. Now, I shouldn't say just a matter of time. That's a bad use of the word just. It was a horrible, horrible 3 years, 43, 44, 45. Okay, but Germany had sort of reached its limit and hadn't been able to ultimately keep the Soviet Union at bay. The big meat grinder, by the way, the big thing that really kills off the Nazis is the Soviet Union, the Soviet Army. Okay. Now, what happens on the home front? Remember those two images I gave you at the beginning, where one was a battle scene and then one was on the home front? How did the United States mobilize economic resources and promote popular support for the war effort? Well, the way they did it was by transforming the federal government. Okay. By the end of World War II, some 50 million men had registered for the draft. 10 million had been inducted into the military. Military service united Americans from every walk of life, bringing the children of immigrants into contacts with other Americans from a variety of racial and geographic backgrounds. Also, the draft ensured that the burden of military engagement was widely shared throughout American society. Some of you may know that during the Civil War, you could buy a substitute. You could purchase a substitute. If you had to register for the draft, but if you were drafted, you could pay a certain amount of money and pay for a substitute. That became extremely unpopular among lots of people, because of course more wealthy men in the Union paid for a substitute, and so poor men went to war, which is almost always the case, but it was really bad. So anyway, the more egalitarian nature of the World War II draft was very, very important. Ties between corporations and the federal government grew much closer during World War II. Some business executives took key positions in federal agencies that were supervising war industries. Roosevelt handed out incentives to increase production. Most federal spending went to the largest companies, okay, and that they sped up. This sped up a long-term trend towards economic concentration. By the world's end, by the war's end, the 200 biggest industrial firms represented nearly half the corporate assets in the United States. Okay? I don't know what it is today, but this is an enormous chunk of corporate assets. Wartime production was, gargantuan in scale and frankly shocking. It's in its intensity, not only making military equipment by the millions of pieces, but leading to the inventions of things such as radar, jet engines, early computers. Allies of all different stripes, all combatants worked on these sorts of things. And the war helped restore the reputation of big business that the Depression had tarnished. Okay. Federal funds restored old manufacturing areas and fostered new ones. On the West Coast, and particularly places like Southern California, absolutely boomed because of war production and frankly post-war production too. It became a home to steel and aircraft production. The South, where outmigration and military-related factories and shipyards shifted employment. In the South, outmigration and military-related factories and shipyards shifted employment from agriculture to industry. People had been leaving the farms in the Great Migration anyway, and then the military contracts became more important, so agriculture declined. But of course, agriculture, in terms of the percentage of people who had been directly involved with it, was declining anyway because of mechanization. Okay, now this raised incomes in the South, but it did not end its deep poverty, the sparse urbanization, and the underdeveloped economy. So it still depended on agriculture, still depended on extractive industries, mining, lumber, oil, and it still depended on manufacturing that was linked to agriculture, such as cotton textiles. Organized labor saw the war as a struggle for freedom that would expand economic and political democracy at home and secure its influence in politics and industry. Okay. By the war's end, unions were entrenched in many economic sectors, and nearly 15 million workers, that's a third of the non-farm labor force, were union members. That's the highest proportion in U.S. history. But labor was a less powerful partner in the war than was business or government. Okay. The New Deal, as you know, had sort of declined, had sort of stalled a little bit in the late 30s, especially with the Second New Deal. Well, this continued during the war, and Congress became thoroughly dominated by a conservative alliance between Republicans and Southern Democrats. They retained Social Security, but they ended programs that they thought were controlled by leftists, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. Okay. Now, many workers protested, demanding wartime conditions and the freeze on wages, which had been imposed by the government, even while corporate profits soared. Okay. And there was a no strike pledge. No strikes during the war, but there were multiple walkouts by 1943 and 1944. War-related production essentially ended the Great Depression. This photograph from 1942, workers wait to be paid at a Maryland shipyard. Now, as this map indicates the military and naval facilities built by the federal government, again, were concentrated in the South and West, but they sparked the economic development of this region dramatically, these regions dramatically, okay? But in terms of actual money, the states that make out, the places that make out the best in terms of war production and the effects on its long-term economy are Texas and West. Pardon me, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, especially California. Okay, the old South doesn't benefit as much, although Birmingham, which is the Pittsburgh of the South, in terms of steel production, did quite well. Okay. Now, remember those four freedoms that Norman Rockwell painted about? Well, and FDR talked about? Okay, that's what I want to talk about here. World War II came to be remembered as the Good War, in which the nation united behind noble aims. Okay? But all wars need the mobilization of public opinion. Okay? And freedom was the prominent theme in efforts to sell the war. Roosevelt believed the four freedoms represented essential American values that could be universalized across the globe. Freedom from fear meant a desire not only for peace, but for long-term security in a chaotic world. The importance of freedom of speech and religion seemed self-evident to Americans, but their prominence emphasized the significance of the First Amendment in American culture. Okay? During the war, the Supreme Court's judges, contrasting American constitutional liberty with Nazi tyranny, upheld the rights of religious minorities to refuse to salute the American flag in public schools, for instance. Now, this was a big difference from the Supreme Court judgments during World War. This was a big change from the general coercive patriotism of World War I. Okay. Now, freedom from want, one of the four freedoms, was the most ambiguous of those four freedoms. Though FDR first used it to refer to eliminating barriers to trade, he soon linked this freedom to guaranteeing a standard of living for American workers and farmers by preventing a return of the Depression. Okay. FDR argued that this would bring, quote, real freedom for the common man. Okay. And remember those Norman Rockwell paintings? Well, they appear in the Saturday Evening Post, and each was accompanied by an essay written by a very prominent American writer or poet. Okay, so it was very, very, very not only highly organized, but it was very culturally based. Okay, again, people were thinking, people were paying attention. By the way, here's a recruitment poster for the Boy Scouts. We too have a job to do in the Boy Scout troops. And again, don't forget, there's my most favorite image in American history is Lady Liberty, and this is Lady Liberty again striding, as she is always depicted, but people don't seem to remember that. Okay, here is something called a patriotic fan. This fan, you don't remember these things, but there were these fans before air conditioning, and you see them in old movies. The patriotic fan, marketed to women during World War II, illustrated how freedom and patriotism were closely linked. Okay, it goes from left to right and asks owners to help the people who own the fan to help win the war effort, preserve American freedom, blah 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 blah. Okay, I'd like to talk about the Office of War Information, which was founded in 1942. Okay, remember, 1942 sounds late, but that's actually really the first year the United States is involved in the war. Okay, it was created to mobilize public opinion. Political divisions created by the New Deal had affected efforts to promote the four freedoms. Some liberal Democrats dominating the writing staff of FDR's executive branch and depicting the conflict as a people's war for freedom. And the OWI was concerned that most Americans supported the war out of a desire for revenge against the Japanese. So what the OWI attempted to do was to convince the American public that the war was being fought for the four freedoms. Okay? And so it used radio, film, the press and other media to give the conflict more ideological meaning while trying to avoid the nationalist hysteria of World War II. Sorry, I keep saying that. The national hysteria of World War I. The OWI utilized deep-seated American traditions, including notions of bringing freedom to the world, right? So they used some World War I rhetoric when it was useful, using the United States, image of the United States as a great emancipator, and on and on and on. Now, there were critics of the OWI who claimed that freedom was being promoted. The freedom that was being promoted was Roosevelt's idea of freedom from the 1930s. Okay, it was New Deal freedom. It wasn't necessarily right-wing libertarian freedom. Okay. Now, eventually Congress eliminated most of the funding for the OWI when it started to believe that it was a political propaganda effort for New Deal social programs as much as it was for the war effort. Okay. So after the OWI was defunded, the, quote, selling of America became a private affair. Private companies joined in efforts to promote wartime patriotism under the guise of the War Advertising Council. Again, remember what I said about these three-letter acronyms of the Office of War Information, OWI, War Advertising Council, WAC. Okay, now, that WC was a private thing. Anyway, alongside advertisements urging Americans to purchase war bonds, guard against revealing military secrets, and grow victory gardens, there was also an emphasis on marketing advertisers' definition of freedom. Okay. They more or less came up with the concept that Roosevelt had overlooked a fifth freedom, freedom of choice through free enterprise. Okay. Americans on the home front enjoyed a prosperity that most could scarcely remember, despite the rationing that happened during the war and rationing of some consumer items. But marketers stressed that the possibilities for consumer goods were endless if they could remain free from government controls. Now, often a lot of this War Advertising Council propaganda was indistinguishable from OWI propaganda, but they were definitely coming from different places. Okay. All right. Now, each side, all sides, I should say, in World War II invoked history to rally support for their cause. This is the rise of Asia, and it depicts Japan liberating Asia from ABCD, which is the imperial oppressors of Americans, British, Chinese, and Dutch. And this is an OWI poster for using the words of Abraham Lincoln to promote the struggle against Nazi tyranny. Okay, world cannot remain half slave and half free. And here is the again. This is an advertisement from Liberty Motors and Engineering Corporation, published in February 1944, in an issue of Fortune magazine. Not the Fortune magazine that we know now, a different magazine. Uncle Sam offers the fifth freedom, right? Free enterprise to a war-devastated Europe. Okay. So what you have here is, like I said, the mobilization of the national government and the nationalization of the war effort is really, really highly significant. And we'll see how that continues and even expands even more in the next lecture.